Hello, my name is Dr. Scott Young with Hearing Solutions Centers, and we're going to talk to you about the 5 things that can destroy your hearing. Coming right up. So those 5 things start with occupational damage. So number 1, at occupational damage, we see that OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, about in the 80s, started to come up with standards for those industries that could cause hearing damage. They started to say at 90 decibels, at maybe 8 hours of continuous sound problems to the ears, that person could see damage. Then they kind of made the calculation easy. It's not perfect. My dad would say it's close enough for government work, but here's the way they said it. At 95, it knocked it down to 4 hours. At 100, it was 2 hours, and so on, all the way up to 120, 125 decibels, which means that you could stand that for maybe a minute and a half. Which leads me to a customer that called me up. He owned a business and he wanted me to look into his problem. You see, he had these huge metal tubes that his employees were working inside of. I don't know what he was doing with all that, but he said that the sound pressure in that place was 135 decibels. He said, it's your job to fix this. It's not my job to fix it, because OSHA actually has very strict standards. Number 1, you have to have ear protection when you're more than 90 decibels, and you also have to do engineering controls around it. But he wanted me to knock it down by 45 decibels. It was physiologically impossible to do. There's no way to fix that because I can only do at about 30 decibels. Number 2, we have recreational hearing damage. So at number 2, with recreational hearing damage, I wanted to say something a little bit about the generations. You see, the generations of the greatest generation, the World War II people that fought in that amazing war, and the traditional generation, they were kind of the in-between. They were alive in World War II, all the way to the baby boomers, older baby boomers, had the potential for more occupational damage. Very young baby boomers, which is like me, X, Y, and the Z generation actually do something called recreational damage. They're wearing headphones and iPods and all this other stuff inside of their ears. Now sometimes they have big headphones, and sometimes they have just the little earbuds. And then all these companies try to come up with something that will sort of work with the ear, but they're actually causing damage. I had a lady that came into my office probably about 25 years ago. She said, my son's causing himself damage. Stop him. You want me to fix your kid? I don't think so. He's 17, this is about 92 or something like that. And I said, if you want to see me in a few years, you can just wear hearing aids. Well, I don't want to do that. It is what it is, bud. That's what you're moving toward. Now, thirdly, we're going to talk about musicians. Now, musicians actually have a difficult thing involved in their lives. They're around loud noises. Now, most of you have been around a concert. That can be 110, 120 decibels. If you're in casinos or in outdoor stadiums, all this kind of stuff, you've got a lot of loud noises. Now, if you see those things on the stage, they're called wedges. They look like speakers. It's because the musicians need to hear the other sounds around them. Now, the bigger that the performance is, you'll start seeing these things, and I'm taking out my hearing aids for a second, you'll start seeing these things called in-ear monitors. Now, an in-ear monitor is something that a good audiologist knows how to do, but that's something that we do in our office. And those things can range anywhere from $250 up to as much as $1,500, depending upon what you want to do. Now, mine have a cool guitar pick on it, but what happens with this, I'm going to have 31 decibels of knockdown of sound. because it's custom made for my ear. And then I can plug this in to what's this called an aviom. Now on stage, whether you're in a church or whether you're in a hall, they'll have this aviom system that sends a signal out to the soundboard. And that signal out lets that person actually set exact settings for their needs. So if they're the guitarist, they want to hear the drummer less and not more. But the other problem that happens is the bleed on stage. So musicians also have a significant sound damage that can happen because the drummer, if he's not caged, and I'm not talking about on bars, I'm saying around a glass cage, he's got to have that glass plastic, kind of cage where it protects the other people. But he's also got to have good ear protection so that he's not causing himself damage. Now, if you've noticed those first three, the occupational, the recreational, and the musician, they all have music or they have sound damage. And we call them noise-induced hearing loss. And for audiologists, it looks exactly the same. So you need to protect your hearing, and we're here to help you with that. Fourthly, are Q-tips. Now we talked about that. If you've subscribed to my channel, you've heard me talk a little bit about this. But I remember I was a young audiologist, and this otologist actually wrote in his chart note, he said there was a misadventure with a Q-tip. I'm a young kid, I have no idea what he said. I'm like, what was that about? Here's what happened. The mom's sitting there with the Q-tip, and the kid walked up and said, "Mom," and poked it right through the eardrum. Now, if Q-tips, the Johnson & Johnson would have changed the Q-tip design, and they've made a couple changes, but it still pokes right through eardrums. Here's what happens. You're going to see on screen is a ear here. When you're in the cartilage section and you're using a Q-tip, which I do not recommend, when you're in that, you're tickling your ear. When you're into the bony section, you'll see that little white area there. The bony section is kind of an irritated response that you'll have. If you happen to poke your eardrum, not go through, but poke it, you'll have a jerked back response, which is a significant pain response. Now, as a person who's had 3 ACL surgeries and a bunch of other procedures, I mean, I hate surgery. It's just what I've lived through, unfortunately, because it's painful. There is nothing like poking something through your eardrum. If you poke it in the right way, you could actually destroy the bones, and it is a very major surgery. If that ossicular chain would have to be completely rebuilt, it's a big damage problem that you can fix by just not using it. And number 5, we have ototoxic drugs. Oto means ear, toxic means bad, and drugs. So ear bad drugs. Now, remember we just talked about the greatest generation? The greatest generation used to die from ear infections. You see, the ear infection would happen in the middle ear, in that space behind the eardrum. Fluid would fill up, then get infected, and then seep into the bones all the way into the meningeal layer. And it would get in and mess that up. The temperature would rise in the child and then boil the brain, and guess what? You're dead. And so it is a big problem for that generation. They died from a lot of those things. Now, we also have meningitis. When you have a high temperature of 105, and by the way, if your kids get 102, 103 temperature, be careful, because that's really on the dangerous section. It doesn't take much before they can burn out the brain. And they can burn out really of the sensory items, the vision, the hearing. They could have mental retardation. It's a big deal. Now, that type of problem has gone down dramatically for mostly the baby boomers when penicillin came out. So we started to see these crazy hearing losses. I remember early in my career, I'd see all these weird hearing losses, and they were all related to penicillins. which leads me to our final story. The burn units are probably the toughest places for people to visit. Now, as an audiologist, I had to go up there. I was at University Hospital in Denver. This is 1991. And there was a guy on the burn unit. There were two people that just struck me up all the way through. And it messed me up when I saw them. And I had to do that before I could go into surgery because you had to know if you could handle surgery. So the first gentleman had burns on 90% of his body. Now, I want you to understand, if you have burns on 90% of your body, they have to do a debridement period, and they have to basically rip off the skin. There is no amount of morphine that can make that person not feel it anymore. You are absolutely going to feel it, and it's an agony time frame. Now, me as an audiologist, they don't want me around. They don't want me bugging them, so I'd lay the headphones by them and test their hearing. And I would talk to the physician and say, dude, we gotta knock down the drugs maybe a little bit. And he said, no, I'm trying to keep them alive. It was a teeter-totter balance. The last patient that I saw in the burn unit was more interesting. Now, first, I didn't see anything wrong with him. And you know, I knew he was on the burn unit. I had to test his hearing because he was on ototoxic drugs, very significant streptomycin. And he was looking away, and I'm coming to the right, and I didn't see any bandages anywhere. And then he turned his head, and half of his face was off. He looked like something out of a medical textbook. You see, south of Denver is Pueblo, about 2.5 hours south of there. He was so rip-roaring drunk that he didn't notice that Drano was on half of his face. It was on there for more than 20 minutes. It ripped off every skin layer. He was in agony. I sat with him for 20, 30 minutes after I tested him, and I realized if I could handle that, I was gonna be fine in surgery. And that was pretty much true. I was okay after 4 hours. I was getting hungry, and I was okay to go and handle all of that. And that's something that audiologists do. So what we talked about here are occupational damage, recreational damage, music damage. We also talked about Q-tips, and lastly, ototoxic drugs. Now, if you like what we're talking about, subscribe to us. Ask me some questions if you're wondering about some other potential damage, and I will try to explain it the best that I can, but I can't give you a diagnosis just on email. Next week, we're going to talk about the grossest things we've found in the ears. We'll see you then.